Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, the Chief Executive of the City Club and also a proud member. And here in the midst of the sheltering in place that we're all doing in light of the coronavirus pandemic, we're presenting a virtual forum from the studios of IdeaStream, our public media partner. As you know, last week we gathered medical and public health professionals to discuss responses to the pandemic and how we can all do our part to slow the spread of COVID-19 and to flatten the curve. Today, we're looking at the impact on our economy. We're looking at the impact today and looking ahead in the coming weeks and months, and also at how our community and our nation is preparing to meet those challenges. So as in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions. You can text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And if you're on Twitter, you can also tweet them at the City Club. We'll work them all in the second half of the program. And as we begin, I also want to thank sponsors and members who have stepped up to support our efforts to continue the conversation in the midst of this crisis, especially the Western Reserve Area Agency on Aging, Sisters of Charity Foundation, Everstream, and City Club board member Mark Ross of PwC, as well as many others who have stepped up. You inspire us, and we thank you. So I want to introduce our panelists. Dr. Susan Helper is the Frank Tracy Carlton Professor of Economics at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. She was formerly Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Commerce and a member of the White House staff. She's been a speaker at the City Club in the past. Sue Helper, so glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Also with us, economist Jack Kleinhentz. Dr. Kleinhentz is the chief economist for the National Retail Federation. They represent retailers from Main Street, mom and pop shops to Amazon and Walmart, grocery stores and restaurants. In other words, Jack Kleinhentz is charged with examining the economic impact on retailers that are shutting down and those that have never worked harder to keep inventory on the shelves. Jack, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleased to be here. Thank you.
Also with us is Dale Anglin. She's looking at this from a different perspective. She is program director at Cleveland Foundation, tasked with helping to coordinate the COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund, which is a collaborative effort by a legion of local and regional philanthropic entities. Cleveland Foundation is the administrator of the Rapid Response Fund. Dale Anglin, thank you for making time for us today as well.
Nice to join you.
Jack Kleinhentz, can you help us understand what has happened over the last 2 weeks?
Dan, obviously, this is a situation that's really quite unimaginable. From our perspective, we've never seen anything like this before. I mean, effectively, we are stopping the economy in order to save lives, and the ramifications are really uncertain. We have no playbook on how to handle this outbreak and how to handle the economy under these circumstances. From a retail standpoint, many of our retailers have either decided to close or have closed, and this epidemic that we have, the coronavirus, is certainly a moving target. We're in constant communication with our members, our retailers, and government and health officials, and we don't know how long it's going to last. We know, obviously, as reported, that select retailers like warehouse clubs, grocery, drugstores are seeing excessive buying and stockpiling, while other retailers are struggling. Many of them had to close, and many of these retailers are small businesses, and they're working hard to maintain their businesses, obviously. And we're hearing from retailers that they are experiencing disruptions. It's really too soon to determine the full impact. We don't see any inflection point right now because of the coronavirus, so it's really hard to sort of map out how this will continue into the economy. But certainly in the next 3 to 4 weeks, we can be hopeful that we flatten the curve. But there's really no way to candy coat this. We're in a uncertain situation. It's difficult to navigate. I suspect that the economy will contract over the next couple of quarters, and it's not only domestically, regionally, but also globally. So it's really difficult to put any real heavy positive spin given what we have in front of us.
There have been projections all over the map about that the amount of job losses could range as high as 3 million before this is all over. At the same time, we have seen you and I were talking earlier about the unemployment claims in the state of Ohio, which last week were somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000, and this week are somewhere between 110, 115,000. What are you and your colleagues looking at in terms of scenarios that are, worst case to best case?
Well, I can't represent the state, but I mean, it's important to recognize that the state had been working to pay off its borrowed funds from the past recession, and I believe we have paid back the funds that we had borrowed. However, from what I read on the website, our unemployment funds might be under the level we need for a moderate recession. At least that's the context that is on the website. So there's not much that we can do, or I can do, or our organization can do directly at any state level. Many states are probably it could be in better shape, but I don't know that information. And some are probably even in worse situations. So I'm not going to be surprised if we have another situation in the months ahead that there'll be need for federal funding for more unemployment compensation and even extensions on unemployment benefits.
With respect to the shifting in labor, as some retailers have laid people off, and are we seeing that grocery stores and drugstores and discount stores and the like are increasing, are actually in a moment where they're hiring?
Well, you've already heard probably reports that Walmart, I believe today, said that they were looking to hire. If I'm mistaken, please excuse me, but I thought that there was a possibility of 100,000, which seems a large number. And then I know that Amazon is doing the same. They're both trying to keep up with demand, as well as the ability to transport the products to individual homes and households where they are needed. So I think it'll be a function of different areas. We also have heard just locally, if I'm not mistaken, correct me, but I think Gojo, which makes the hand sanitizers, was also looking to increase production, and they needed more people. So I think it's going to depend on different products that are needed by households as to the extent there will be a gearing up and an increased demand for workers.
Turning to Sue Helper, let me just say Jack Kleinhens is a chief economist with the National Retail Federation. Sue Helper, economist and economics professor at Case Western Reserve University. I know some of what you have been looking at in terms of how this moment has revealed weaknesses in various parts of the economy has to do with the supply chain issues, both in healthcare and more broadly. Could you explain a little bit about what you've learned? I think we're having trouble getting Sue Helper. Sue Helper, are you there?
I can hear you. Yes, I can now hear you.
Okay,
yes.
Great, wonderful. Sue, I was just asking about the supply chain work that you've been engaged in, the research about fissures in the supply chain that have been revealed as a result of this economic moment.
Yeah, it first started with auto industry not being able to get parts from China and other industries, and now we're seeing shortages in our medical product supply chain, a lot of which, many layers of which, come from China. So we get about 80% of our pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical ingredients from China. We get masks from China, and we get the raw materials for masks from China. And so that's made it hard, or it's one of the factors making it hard to ramp up our supply of these supplies that will be needed very soon, and even right now.
Specifically, could you talk a little bit about well, actually more broadly, rather than just the healthcare, but the healthcare supply chain, but other areas in which supply chain issues have emerged that really register as not only threats to our economy, but potentially threats to national security?
So I think the medical supply chain issue is the most critical right now. We're not getting automotive components from China right now, but that's not actually a critical issue right at this moment, because people are not buying cars. The auto companies, the auto plants have shut down because they're worried about infecting their own workers. I think the critical issues really are in getting enough masks to people. So we actually already have reports of doctors that are rationing their masks, putting their own health at risk to help other patients. We worry that there may not be enough ventilators, that once the full force of the disease really hits, that we may need 5 to 10 times as many ventilators as we have to help people with breathing. So both of these, all of these are critical issues.
So earlier this week, the president announced and sort of invoked the Defense Production Act, which sent a lot of folks running to Wikipedia to find out what exactly the Defense Production Act is. He says he doesn't necessarily want to use it at this point, but he talked about it as a tool in the federal toolbox. Can you help us understand exactly what it is and how its use might change things?
Yeah, it gives the president incredible powers to allocate and direct production in the U.S. So it can say to a company making ventilators that you must fill the government's orders first. It can even say to auto companies, you have to start making ventilators or other products. So it's potentially a really great tool, but it needs to be activated soon. So as of a couple days ago, hospitals or ventilator companies were saying, hey, we could actually expand our capacity. We don't have orders. So at the very least, the government needs to be placing some orders for ventilators. We need to be increasing demand for masks. And I think the thing about this exponential growth, it sounds like math, but every person who gets infected infects someone else, and that person goes on to infect other people. So you really need to take action before you think there's a problem. And we've seen that in Ohio with the Governor DeWine, closing restaurants and bars at a time when there were only several dozen cases in Ohio. And I think the wisdom of his approach has been shown, but I think we don't see that level of urgency in the federal government. I think that the president's saying he hopes he doesn't have to use the authority. The time to use the authority is now. It's going to take us several months to get enough ventilators for the predicted spike in the need for them when people really start getting sick.
Sue Helper is the Frank Tracy Carlton Professor of Economics at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Sue, let me ask you, in terms of the economics of something like ventilators and ventilator manufacturers saying we don't have any orders, we could certainly ramp up production if asked, but nobody's ordering that. Is that because hospitals are reluctant to spend the money themselves because they don't want to be stuck on the other side of this with a bunch of ventilators, with an oversupply of ventilators that they're not using on a regular basis, that from a rational, quote, rational economic standpoint, doesn't make sense to have later, which is why the federal government needs to step in to create the market that doesn't exist yet.
That's exactly right. Somebody needs to bear the risk in the economy of a pandemic like this. This particular pandemic was not predicted, but the idea of pandemics has been known for a long time. And so we really need the government to step in and be the purchaser of last resort.
So I want to ask also about other policy and Jack Kleinhans, I'd like to hear from you on this as well. Earlier, I think it was earlier this week, it's hard to know right now to remember when things happen, because every day feels like both an eternity and really fast. But at some point in the recent past, the federal government, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to virtually zero, or to just a quarter of a percentage point, I think. Please correct me. That
it was,
I think
actually March 15th.
It was March 15th, so that's just 5 days ago. But am I right? They lowered the interbank rate to just a quarter of a percentage point. Is that correct? Or to zero?
That's correct. It's a range that goes between 0 and a quarter of a point. Yes. So
is that the last nail in the, or the sort of last tool that they have at their disposal? I mean, in terms of fiscal policy, they've got sort of one lever, and that seems like it's maxed out.
Well, they've actually turned to some of the experience that they used during the Great Recession. That is, they restarted quantitative easing by increasing Treasury and mortgage-backed security purchases of somewhere around $500 billion and $200 billion, respectively. They cut the discount window. This is where banks can go and borrow money very cheaply. And many banks have been to the window, and it was at 1.5%. Now it's down to a quarter of a percent. And there's been reduced reserve requirements. These are a lot of technicalities, but a very important thing to keep liquidity in the economy. They've also reduced the rate on liquidity swaps. What that is, U.S. dollar liquidity swaps. This is where other central banks are actually buying U.S. dollars, whether they're from the Bank of England, Bank of Japan, et cetera, because we are the reserve currency, and the dollars are really needed in many ways for the functioning of international payments and the liquidity for companies. There are many obligations that are issued in dollar formats, whether in other countries. So that's certainly a factor that they've undertaken, and that all occurred back on March 15th. And then on St. Patrick's Day, they established a commercial paper funding facility. This is where the Fed is actually in the commercial paper market and able to provide liquidity for that market. Commercial paper is loans that are debt that's issued on a short-term basis by corporations, not banks, and it's a pretty fluid market, but it also has been clogged up because of the uncertainty. Just a couple more. I'm sorry to go down the list, but it's really important that they really have increased the amount of liquidity in the economy. There is the establishment of a money market mutual fund liquidity facility. This was a real critical one back during the Great Recession. A lot of people have their money that is actually moved out of their checking accounts into money market mutual funds to get some return, and they could be, and they were at risk back in the Great Recession. So the Fed has basically expanded to that degree. Now, can they do more? Yes. I mean, even to the extent that they create more of a jawboning of an ability for them to provide guidance to what the future is expected. That would be to say we're going to keep rates low, even beyond where the point where we might get back to quote unquote some normalcy, and they'll be there to support these markets and to help these markets. The power of explanation is really critical, and not just the finances and the liquidity, but I think to turn to organizations like the Fed, and that goes for what Susan was just talking about. The power of explanation by Congress and the administration is very critical right now, and I think that this helps people understand what might happen from the standpoint of having liquidity. It helps to prevent bankruptcies and insolvencies. So it's a interrelated, interconnected activity that across organizations, government support, and the Federal Reserve.
That's Jack Kleinhentz. He's the chief economist with the National Retail Federation. Susan Helper of Case Western Reserve University is with us as well, along with Dale Anglin of the Cleveland Foundation. I want to, Dale, before we get to you and what the philanthropic community is bringing to the table right now, which is very important information, very important help. Sue Helper, just coming back to things that government can do alongside the Federal Reserve. Jack has outlined what the Federal Reserve is engaging in right now and what else they might do. You have been looking at what other nations are doing to support small businesses and other enterprises, and we know that the federal government right now is engaged in some very large-scale, quote-unquote, bailouts of not just the American consumer but also American businesses. Can you give us a sense of what's happening, what's likely to work, and what else ought to be considered?
Yeah, so there are some proposals that are surprisingly bipartisan to just funnel cash to Americans. And, normal times we'd be worried about people misusing the cash or people aren't really, fundamentally deserving of the cash. But in this case, with unemployment rising so rapidly, I think would be really a great idea. And it's in the Senate and the House bills to send, checks to every American, make sure that the mortgage gets paid, make sure that people can buy food, et cetera, while they are staying home from work to protect all of us. So that's one thing. There are the SBA is increasing, the Small Business Administration increasing its ability to take loan requests from business. I think this is all great. I think there are things that there is this medical supply part of the economy that we really need to be ramping up right now. We have some capacity that we're not using, as we discussed. The federal government should be doing more on that front. I think you also want to avoid doing things that make the next crisis worse. So, there's everybody's, this is now a great time to pile on and ask for a bailout. So the fracking companies want a bailout because the price of oil is so low. And, by all means, help the workers that are unemployed. But, fracking is just going to make climate change, which could be the next big crisis, worse. So I think we need to both act very quickly. And this idea of sending money to people, I think, is really a great one. But also, in this period, while we want the economy to be slow, we can be planning, I think, for future, how do we make supply chains more robust, not only in medical supply chains, but also thinking about automotive, other kinds of equipment where we're so dependent on these highly fragile chains that involve many crossings of borders. And as we've seen, that can all just disappear in an instant.
Thank you. Sue Helper is a Frank Tracy Carlton Professor of Economics at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. I want to come back to some of those ideas a little bit later if we can. Dale Anglin, turning to you now, there was Cleveland Foundation and other philanthropic organizations have announced the creation of a COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund. And I know that with the Cleveland Foundation operating as the administrator of this fund, you've been tasked with coordinating much of the work. Can you talk about where this came from, what it's doing, how it's going to work?
Thank you very much for having me, Dan. So the Greater Cleveland COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund is a partnership with now over 20 philanthropic and government organizations in our region. And we came together very quickly in less than a week because we recognized that this was an unprecedented crisis, and philanthropy, no one foundation was going to be able to address the many issues that are going to arise short-term and long-term. And we felt that we've worked together before in other areas, around lead, around Say Yes. And so we had a history, some of us, of working together. And originally a few came together and then more joined very quickly. And I got to say, I am very proud of the philanthropic and the government community doing that, raising over $4 million in less than 5 days.
$4 million in less than 5 days. That is impressive. How will the group, the collaborative, decide how to deploy those resources?
So one, I want to use the phrase that one of the other speakers said, there's no playbook for this.
Mm-hmm.
So we are working together to think through exactly how we deploy those funds. And right now, we will be trying to get funds out on a regular basis, trying to do that weekly. We're also trying to prioritize very basic needs right now to make sure that we're just making it through the next few weeks while we're also trying to think long term. So we're looking at organizations that support community safety nets, basic needs, particular populations that are stressed by what's going on or affected by the COVID-19 virus. So that would be, it used to be people over the age of 60, although the stats in the U.S. are seemingly changing that a little bit. Children, low income, there's a group of groups of populations that we think are going to be affected right away. And we're trying really hard to make sure that we're working with organizations first that affect large groups of those populations so that we can use our money, have our money go a long way.
Let me just take a moment to say that we're getting close to the Q&A portion of our City Club Forum. If you're just joining us on the live stream, it's you are in the middle of a City Club Forum here with Dale Anglin. She's with the Cleveland Foundation, which is coordinating the Greater Cleveland COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund, a fund of more than $4 million that's been raised in just 5 days, and they're still accepting, of course, ongoing contributions, and they anticipate that growing. We'll have more information coming up about how to get in, how to apply for those funds for consideration of grant requests and so forth. If you'd like to ask a question of our panelists, Dale is joined by Sue Halper from Case Western Reserve University and Jack Kleinhentz, who's the chief economist for the National Retail Federation. You can text questions to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794 if you'd like to text a question. And if you'd like to tweet a question, you can tweet it at the City Club. We'll work those questions into the program. Dale Anglin, continuing on the Rapid Response Fund information, how do organizations apply for assistance?
So we are using, we technically don't have an application process, but we have on our landing page on the Cleveland Foundation website, and also on the United Way website. United Way is a big partner as part helping us process all of this. There's a website email, and that email is COVID-19 response at clevefdn.org. And people can email an organization, not a person, can email their organizational needs, what population they're serving, and we will collect all of that information, and every week that information will be shared with all of our funders, and we'll make decisions about how the money gets dispersed that week.
I'm just going to repeat that email address, make sure I heard it, and then we'll do our best to get it on our website as well. It's COVID-19 response at clevefdn.org.
Correct.
Okay.
And also there's still, this is a fund that is continuing to accept donations indefinitely, not just from foundations. We are asking for donations from corporations, from individuals. No dollar is too small. We'll take everything. It all goes out to help our fellow residents. And people can donate at clevelandfoundation.org/response.
Okay. And they can also get in touch with you directly. I'm sure your email address and so forth, or information how to reach you, is on the Cleveland Foundation website. Dale Anglin,
right.
Is this in lieu of, in place of existing grant-making programs right now, or is this in addition to?
This is in addition to, so I want to be very clear. All of our foundations are continuing their regular grant making. And so if an organization has a relationship with a foundation, has already gotten dollars from a foundation, they should be in touch with their program officer. A number of the foundations are relaxing rules, turning project support into general operating support. You don't need to sometimes turn in your grant reports. This is in addition to that regular grant making. This is a way that we felt like we could work together. We could share what we're learning on the ground, and we could think through, given that there's no playbook, how do we meet as many needs as we can early in this crisis, but also think about long-term recovery. What will it take? Definitely not one foundation can do this alone.
Susan Helper, I want to turn to you right now from the point of view, the perspective of a research economist. Can these sorts of efforts, I know that the Greater Cleveland collaborative effort that Dale has described is one of many that are being formed across the country right now. Can these make a difference?
Oh, most definitely. They're so important, and I think the speed that Dale is talking about is also very important, that, if we can prevent people from, missing their rent payments, from going hungry, that supports the grocery store workers. All that's really important. But, we could be looking at, 15, 20% unemployment if the crisis goes unabated, for a short period. And so we really need the federal government to step in because only they really have the firepower to really stop it. But these early local efforts are so important, and I really commend the foundations for doing them.
Dale Anglin, in terms of process, and I know I mentioned just a second ago that there are other entities that are doing this across the country, and community foundations are both the logical leaders of this and a welcome leader in these efforts. What kinds of processes are you learning that different community foundations and their collaborators are using? And also, what kind of priorities?
We're sharing. I will just say there's over 100 of these funds that have opened up over the last week. And we're all taking the lead from the Seattle Community Foundation because they were hit first and they started this first. And so I thank all of my community foundation colleagues in particular for helping those of us manage through this crisis and learn from what they're doing. Most of us are highlighting basic needs first: food, medical supplies, things like, to be honest, mental health support for families that aren't used to having their special needs children at home with them all day. Nothing's off the table yet, but we are trying to make sure the basic needs of our community, and particularly hard-hit populations like low income, like special needs, like health compromised populations, are met first. And we're trying to go with organizations that we know can get those funds out very quickly and have the staff and the support to do that.
And are there specific, I think when I read correct me if I'm wrong, but when I read the press release about this, it sounded as if there are specific sort of guiding principles that all the collaborators have signed on to that have to do with targeting funds specifically to communities that have long been especially vulnerable and are even more vulnerable in this time.
Yeah, and I want to say one of our first priorities is that we know that our dollars are a drop in the bucket, that the federal government and state and county governments always have more dollars and more levers to push than what we do. And so we're also, as a first step, working with as many of those partners as we can find, and it's been a great partnership, to support whatever changes that they need to make sure that these social safety nets like unemployment and homeless services and supports for our homebound seniors, that those are met through their agencies first. Whatever we can do to help spread their dollars and help the programs that they have, which are much larger than what we fund, is our first priority. And then we're trying to figure out what are the large organizations in the region, of which there are many, that work with a large number of either other smaller organizations or large numbers of people. And one of the best examples is our Greater Cleveland Food Bank, right? They support so many food pantries around the region. How can we help a group like that help their people and pantries that they support.
Dale Anglin is a program director at the Cleveland Foundation. She's been tasked with coordinating the Greater Cleveland COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund on behalf of a large group and a growing group of philanthropic organizations. Here at the City Club today, it's a virtual forum looking at the economy and the economic impact of the coronavirus and this pandemic. If you'd like to join the conversation, if you have a question that you'd like to ask our panelists, text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And as always, you can also tweet a question at the City Club, and we'll work it in. Question about the ripple effects here. What will happen to public entities such as RTA, Metro Health, or even municipal towns and cities that are taking enormous hits to their revenue? Susan Helper, this sounds like sort of echoes. Like they may not be taking enormous hits right now, but they will in a few months and next year.
Yeah, no, I think, ridership on the RTA is way down. We've, and this is actually really important in reducing the spread of the disease. Every contact that we can reduces the possibility of spreading that disease to someone else. It's really important that the RTA business is down, and I think this is a reason why we're going to need various kinds of support, from the federal government. The states generally cannot run deficits. Their tax money goes down, then their ability to spend money goes down, and so that's why we really depend on the federal government, both the Federal Reserve, as Jack said, but also fiscal policy. So the government running these big deficits, and I think, an important thing to recognize is that, when this is over, we're a strong economy. We're going to be just as hardworking, just as smart as we were. But what we need to do now is just make sure that we spend whatever it takes, and to make sure that we're strong, and make sure that we take actions now that will increase our ability to respond to these things in the future. And responding to these issues at the RTA, at local and state governments, is really important.
Jack Kleinhans, another question from our audience. What will happen to banks when restaurants, airlines, cruise lines, and others can no longer repay their loans?
Well, I think that's the whole purpose behind the bailout package, is to keep those companies solvent so that they can meet their debt requirements. And I think at the same time, smaller businesses and individuals need the same type of support. We're putting a big hole on the income side of the economy. This loss of income is going to be huge. We don't really know, we don't have any data that as we get through this, how we restart the engine. We think the chassis, as Susan was saying, we were actually going into this pandemic with actually good fundamentals, but now we're forcing ourselves into a stop. So if you ever been in a highway where the traffic is backed up 5 miles on a turnpike, and we're waiting, and then slowly you move, but it takes hours. I mean, just imagine this huge economy that has been brought down into a stop position. Now, we're still operating, don't get me wrong. I mean, we aren't completely stopping. Many parts of our industry, but when you start talking about the retail, the leisure, the hospitality industry, these are large numbers of people that are being employed. And if those people do not get income, they're not going to spend. And if you don't have spending, you have this kind of reinforcing issue that businesses and individuals are going to be having to deal with. So I think that the advocacy that we need to increase, and as Susan just mentioned, whatever it takes, is very important. Can we hold on? Can we afford this? Mm-hmm. This $1 trillion is another question. Well, you know what? Yes, we actually spent in 2009 $1.4 billion on the Stimulus Act, which bailed out banks and other organizations, and then we had another $1.3 billion in 2010 for tax cuts and the American Health Program. So the economy is larger than it was back then, and it can be much more resilient than what we see today or we imagine over the next quarter. So this is a critical path. I think that the support is required. The unfortunate thing is, and my last comment is that not everybody is equal when it comes to income, whether it be a business or a household, and the needs are different if you're a small business or if you're a low-income person. And the longer we dilly-dally about developing aid, the longer these people are in uncertainty, and then the longer we start to deal with the problem and find a solution. So I'm very anxious that we come to some decision quickly, hopefully within the next, within today or the next day, that Congress can act diligently.
A related question came to us via Twitter asking, and you probably don't have a crystal ball to be able to answer this, but you'd be able to talk about the stakes, Jack Kleinhans and Sue Helper. Will the state of Ohio suspend sales tax requirements today? The due date is Monday, and the hospitality industry doesn't know if the state will impose penalties for non-payment. Many would deplete cash reserves to pay it or have to borrow to make those payments. Sue Helper, your thoughts?
So I wanted to just chime in, I think, on a more general point and then come to the specific. I think that it's really important to have quick bailouts to individuals. I think that's so important, and small business. I worry about bailouts to large business without conditions. So, take the airlines. I think they are a systemically important business. We need airlines, but they actually took actions that make them more vulnerable. They bought back so much stock and basically used up almost all of the cash flow that they had collected due to their enormous profits. And so they're in an extremely weak position due to their own actions. And so I think that, before money goes to those businesses as opposed to their workers, we need to really think about conditions on, banning stock buybacks, making sure the money doesn't go to executives, et cetera. So there needs to be, I think, quick action on people who, this really happened through no fault of their own. They're small. They're not going to determine the course of the future economy. But then much more care in making sure that we don't make the next problem worse. I think it's a lesson we should have learned from 2008, 2009. On the sales tax, Jack may be better to answer. A problem that the state has is that they need to balance their budget. Mm-hmm. And so if they forego that income, then they can put less out. Now, if they know there's going to be revenue sharing from the feds to make up that shortfall, or there's also a proposal from Americans for Financial Reform to allow the Fed to actually buy up obligations from state and local governments. If they knew that some kind of relief like that was happening, then they could do it. But I'm not sure in the absence of that they can.
Jack Kleinhans?
Well, one thing that, to build off of what Susan said, is, though, we did rebuild our rainy day fund, the state of Ohio. If I'm not mistaken, under the previous administration. That was a priority. So to a certain extent, the sales taxes, if we're delayed, probably could be offset by funds from that rainy day fund. But it's a major flywheel. Taxes are the flywheel for state government to do what it does. So delaying would probably mean a very important part, and I don't know what actions the governor and the state representatives are thinking about to forbear on these in the near term. I'm sure it's being thought of. Let me put it this: I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that they're looking at ways to figure out how to deal with some of these situations. The sales taxes, though, should have been already collected, and I don't think technically I would think that you would be able to use those taxes to run your business. I think, anyhow, I'll leave it at that.
It's a matter of individual business owners and their ability to manage cash flow, I suppose. But Dale Anglin, is this one of the kinds of policies, you mentioned advocacy earlier, is this one of the kinds of policies for which you and other philanthropic organizations might choose to add to your advocacy agenda at this moment?
Well, I think we will be developing an advocacy agenda. Right now, it's looking like that is going to be focused also more directly on our most vulnerable populations. So things like our homeless policies, our policies around unemployment insurance and things like that the state manages. We're not dealing with the federal government right now. Mm-hmm. And all of that is to be determined over the next few weeks as we come together as a foundation body to think through. We've already some of us are putting our names on letters to the governor and things like that to support the work that he is doing to keep this state safe.
Another similar related question came in asking what civic-level rapid response collaborative efforts are underway to help neighborhood-based businesses. Dale Anglin, I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask that, but you're perhaps the only one of our panelists who might be able to answer that.
And a lot of things are coming up, and we'll be spending the next few days triaging, to be honest, and prioritizing. Local neighborhood businesses has come up as an issue. Right now, it looks like for the first couple of weeks, we're going to be focused more on making sure that people are meeting their basic needs, like I said, around food and housing and transportation. We are not right now prepared to talk about some of the economic impacts for those businesses. Not saying we won't, but just for now, we want to make sure people are home safe and able to get their basic needs met.
Jack Kleinhans, across the spectrum of the retail federation and retail outlets that you survey, and also among the consumers that you've recently surveyed, what percentage of businesses are engaging in cost reduction measures, which is sort of a euphemism for laying people off or reducing hours?
That's a question I cannot answer.
Okay.
We know that firms, enterprises are taking action to preserve as best they can their workforce and support them. But remember, we are talking about a very diverse industry. Mm-hmm. We're looking at very large firms, and we're looking at mom and pops and self-employed entrepreneurs. And so this count that we're watching closely on unemployment claims is something that is going to be somewhat of a leading indicator of the severity of what is going to be, impacting not only retail but all industries, and locally and regionally and statewide. So I don't have a number that I can tell you right at this point. The National Retail Federation this past week surveyed consumers about their mood, their intentions, and so forth. What did you learn? Well, thank you for asking, because we did this survey on March 18th, which is only, 3 days ago. So we feel it's pretty timely. We've been doing this on a regular basis, and consumers are much more concerned about the coronavirus than they were a week ago. 86% are moderately, very, or extremely concerned. That's 73% last week, 86% this week. Now, in terms of the concern, 88%. So practically, all except for 10 are worried about the impact on the health of the economy. And that was way up from the previous month. They are worried about their jobs. Since we've been talking a lot about jobs, and maybe an indirect way to answer the question that was offered me a minute ago. Mm-hmm. But these are households, okay, and not the retail workers, but households, 46%. Nearly 50% are worried about losing their jobs and income, and that's that has now doubled from where it was a week ago. So we've been talking about this acceleration of concern and confidence and anxiety, and how are they doing in terms of their behavior in shopping? Well, they're actually attempting to change their shopping behavior significantly. They're avoiding shopping centers. 50% of them are. They're stocking up on household items. We've been seeing reports considerable on TV and elsewhere. They're trying to shop at other times. And despite the concerns about the health of the economy and their impact to their personal finances, it's an interesting indication of how people are looking at this right now. I think this will change over time. But 77% still report that they have not yet pulled back on their spending. And this is actually down from last week, which is 84%. So this whole idea about confidence and that there will be support from the government and state, local, federal government, I think is very important to backstop people's thoughts about their personal finances and their ability to sustain themselves during this period of time.
Thank you, Jack Kleinhans. Sue Halper, final question from our listening audience and our viewing audience, our streaming audience to you. What permanent changes to the economy do you expect to see?
Wow, I think that's a question where all of us, our collective voice, can really determine what that looks like. One possibility, and there was a New York Times article about this morning, of the lobbyists swoop in, and we have support for airlines to essentially do what they do, fracking to do what they do. Even Adidas wants a tax break for gym membership. So that's one possibility. I think another possibility is that we actually use this as a time to think about, shoring up some of the weaknesses in our economy that makes us vulnerable. So the lack of paid sick leave for a quarter of Americans. It's been addressed somewhat in the current bills, but not in an underlying way. The vulnerability of our supply chains. I mean, I think, we now have in place potentially, I think we could see the urgency of doing things like rebuilding our manufacturing, understanding and predicting the next pandemic. So I think that we can come out of this much stronger, but I think it's going to take, the will and voting and collective action of all of us to do that.
Jack Kleinhans, any thoughts about that question as well?
Well, I think that Susan's ideas are correct, that out of adversity we sometimes get strength, and we see the limitations of the system, and we need to consider the options about reinforcing the good parts and addressing and creating solutions to the ones that are problematic. And I think that the agenda is a very large one. I think that we have to recognize, though, at the same time, that this economy and the consumer and households, they are very resilient because of the freedom we have and the laws that we operate within. And while we go through change and go through this period of time, we also need to take, some benefit from the fact that we are who we are today because we have the kind of capitalist markets with regulatory appropriateness that are able to operate. And I think
so. Long story short, you think we can sustain ourselves? This economy is as troubling as this is. This economy is resilient enough, and our society is resilient enough to withstand.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, our time is a little bit short, Jack, so I thought I'd summarize. Yeah. Jack Kleinhans is Chief Economist for the National Retail Federation. Also with us, Sue Halper, Frank Tracy Carlton, Professor of Economics at Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Dale Anglin joined us as well for the City Club Forum. She's with the Cleveland Foundation, coordinating the COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund, which is a collaborative effort by philanthropic institutions throughout the region. Lots of information on that will be available at our website. It's also available at the Cleveland Foundation's website. I want to thank the three of you, and I want to thank you for joining us as well, the listener and the viewer. This forum was presented virtually, and I apologize, guys. There'd be applause right now if we were at the City Club. It would be huge, massive applause for you guys. Applaud yourselves, please. Yes, thank you very much. I want to thank our partners at IdeaStream for helping us present our City Club Forum today virtually. Our work to continue the conversation in the midst of the pandemic is supported by our members and by the Western Reserve Area Agency on Aging, the Sisters of Charity Foundation, Everstream, and City Club board member Mark Ross of PwC, as well as many others who have stepped up. You can join them and see a complete list when you visit us at cityclub.org. We are going to continue to present our Friday forums throughout this time. So for the moment, we're rescheduling what had been on our calendar for March and April. If you have ideas about topics we should cover while we all learn to shelter in place, please get in touch. We're at cityclub.org. I'm Dan Malthrop. Stay strong, stay healthy, stay close in your hearts if you can't stay close in person. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.